All right, welcome to today's lecture. We're going to be focusing a little bit today on validity, truth, and strength, and how those two are somewhat interchangeable and somewhat different when we're talking about arguments, but ultimately the soundness of an argument. So as we've talked about in previous lectures, we just recently learned how to summarize an argument effectively, how to look at what someone is saying and figure out what the main points are, what the premises and conclusions and claims and such are. We're going to talk a little bit today more about the formality of logic, more about how it works as a system and how it works and how it functions when arguments are done correctly. And to do that, we'll be looking at these three aspects of an argument. So the first thing we need to know is that the soundness is the quality of an argument. A sound argument is one that is both valid and true or strong. Right? We sometimes will use strong interchangeably with soundness, and that can get confusing. We'll talk about strong arguments being good arguments, but what we really mean is that a valid argument and a true or strong argument is sound. So first, let's go ahead and take a look at validity. So in order for an argument to be valid, arguments must follow a logical sequence, they must entail the conclusion, and they must be free of flaws in reasoning. What we mean by this is that validity in arguments, all arguments follow a specific sequence, very similar to math, in that you first have to prove one thing to be true before you can then prove other things to be true. Or you have to know some things or accept them as true in order to come to certain conclusions. But they must all follow a logical sequence that leads us to our conclusion. When we're talking about entailment, right, we're talking about the conclusion must be something that is derived from its premises, right? If we put the premises together in a specific order with specific relationships to one another, they should inevitably lead us to some conclusion. Anyone should be able to take these premises and studying them should be able to draw the same conclusion. That's how we know that we've done our entailment well. And ultimately, we have to make sure that any of our statements, any of our premises, are free from informal logical fallacies. They're free of flaws in reasoning, often based on assumptions or, more accurately, misunderstandings or incorrect assumptions of facts. So we'll go ahead and take a look at some examples of not necessarily informal logic, but formal logic. This is the kind of mathematical sequence that comes along with arguments. So here we have two examples of structures of arguments, right? So if you do this correctly, you should be able to put in anything with these B's and these C's, anything in these variables, and they should lead us to these conclusions, right? So these are both syllogisms. They both have two statements, two premises that lead us to some conclusion. So let's take a look at this first one. We'll go ahead and replace A and B with monkeys and mammals. So all monkeys are mammals. Fair enough, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. No mammals have scales. Okay, so monkeys is A, mammals is B, and having scales is C. So we should see that our conclusion must be no monkeys have scales. So we're not talking about whether or not this is true or not. It happens to be true in this case. That's not really what we're interested in. What we're interested in is the fact that it is valid. Given these premises, following their relationships, we can see that this must also be true. We'll do the same thing over here. So we'll replace A and B with when it's raining and roads being wet. So if it is raining, then the roads are wet. Right? So if A, then B. If the roads are wet, there's our B again, then there will be more accidents on the road. All right. And then finally, we should be able to see this conclusion here. If it is raining, then there will be more accidents on the road. And there it is. So it's very important that we understand that formal logic follows very specific rules and very specific laws that are necessary in order to understand how things relate to one another. And it's the misunderstanding of these laws that most often results in confusions or invalid arguments or problems in argumentation. And another thing very important to keep in mind before we move on to truth and strength of arguments is that validity is not equal to truth or soundness. So you can have a valid argument that is an untrue or a false argument or is an unsound argument. Those things are somewhat independent of each other, and we'll get a little bit more into that explanation in the next slide. So that's it for now, and we'll see you next time.